Hey, Guoba here, in the hot tub again. So many of you guys asked for this video after my Litecoin value ranking, and so you shall receive. I'll be going through every E1 and E2 and seeing which are the highest value pools right now. So the E1 value and then the E2 value separately. By the way, if I make a correction post-release, it will be in my comment below and maybe blurred in the video. That's why Fugue and Anaxacones were blurred in the last video. They should have been lower. And also on the list, there will be old Eidolons that are at the bottom. That doesn't mean they are always terrible. It could just mean you pulled them ages ago and the units got power crept. Same for the Litecoin video. Anyways, let's start, but real quick, thank you to today's sponsor. If you're looking for some pulls and you have cash spare, well, LD Shop may be able to help you out. The HSR section for LD Shop uses UID for safety, so no account information, they aren't logging into your account. I just plop in my server here and my UID, and I choose the bundle I want. These packs are discounted by 13% minimum versus in-game prices and can go up to 25%. After finishing my payment, I can log into my account just after and voila, my Express Pass is here already. If you want more discounts, users that register with my link get a 15% coupon as well as a 5% coupon which can save up to $50, so check it out with my link in the description. There's also a little bonus for those that spend $80 in a month who get an extra Express Pass sent your way. Anyways, stay safe and back to the video. Hey again! So, like last time, we'll first look at the support category. So Harmony units and supportive Nihility units, all in release order and starting with Eidolon 1s. Let's go! Starting with our little wolf. Her E1 is a massive energy boost on ults, letting her access some crazy rotations or forego energy regeneration whilst maintaining ult uptime. So it allows her to either spam out more ults or become her own DPS. However, spamming out more ults requires more SP and is only really used in Acron comps which are quite old now. The becoming her own DPS part is cool, but realistically you might want to pull from modern DPS instead. So I'd say it has some value as a niche pull. Raw May's E1 is a 20% Ignore during her ultimate, or nearly a 12% DPS amp in a vacuum, which can get all the way up to a 23% DPS amp. Since it's Ignore, it is universal, and it works for the whole team. It isn't that strong by itself, and Raw May isn't usually best in slot, but it's still an extra buff for an already nice and easy to use buffer. So whilst it isn't a high priority pull, it still has decent value. Not to mention, you could pick up Raw May for free during 3.2 to 3.4, so the overall cost of E1 Raw May is lower than other units here. And then Sparky offers an extra turn of her ultimate's buff duration as well as a 40% attack buff during said ultimate buff. The problem is that she could just ult on a DPS's turn and it will not tick down at the end of their turn, meaning her ult buff already lasts for 3 DPS action. Maybe it's nice for using it with multi-advanced comps, but that hurts Sparkle's power anyway. And the extra attack buff is alright, but it's not worth that many pulls. So it has okay value, but I would generally recommend against it. Robin, there's not much to say. Her E1 is among the best in the game with a universal and team-wide 24% all-type res pen. It's just Raw May's E1, but pretty much always better, with Robin also being stronger in more teams. The only thing I'd say on it is, since there is always an E1 like this every year, maybe it's best to wait until 4.x's OP E1 support. Then Jiaochu's E1 gives a team-wide damage increase on top of ramping up his damage amp slightly faster. Damage percent is much more common than res pen and def ignore, so it already loses value. And Jiaochu isn't used as frequently or as well as the likes of Robin or Raw May. It's okay, but a skip from me. As for the other, limited by Nihility, E1 Fugue is a massive buff to her archetype. 50% weakness break efficiency is a buff to breaking speed, which helps a ton as toughness values get higher and higher, and it also helps you get to super break and her extra toughness faster, as well as just directly buffing super break damage. It's a very nice vertical investment option for break, but the archetype is suffering right now. So despite it being powerful, I'm going to have to rank it lower due to break being on the back burner. Sunday from the Sim patch has a Def Ignore E1 with 16% to the target character and 40% to their summon. That doesn't mean the target gets 56% combined or anything, it is 16% to them, 40% to specifically the summon. And so without summon, this is very lackluster. Even with a summon, we only have Jingyuan, Aglaea and Castris as main DPS who can really abuse it. That's with Jingyuan not being a top meta pick, Aglaea not having that much of an emphasis on her Memra Sprite damage, and Castris having clunkiness issues with Sunday. So it has potential, but it is very underused right now. And for the strongest support E1 so far, we have Tribby. When dealing damage on your turn with attacks, Tribby will then multiply it by 24% overall as true damage. So like a Robin E1 at a baseline. However, because of how her zone works, this is all concentrated on the highest HP enemy target. So the more enemies on the field and the more enemies that you deal damage to, the better this gets, as it will concentrate a portion of the whole attack onto the target that matters the most. One of the best pulls you can do right now. And finally, Cypher has an upgrade to her recorded damage value, as well as an 80% attack buff on herself that is gonna be permanent. The recorded damage getting bigger is nice, but it actually isn't that big, as the base multiplier isn't gigantic. The attack buff from E1 could be cool if she did nice damage at E0, but her personal contribution in a team is pretty minimal, unfortunately. So again, it's okay since it's more amped like Jiao Shou, and she is used much more than him, but a skip from me still. So here's my final rankings on the support E1s. If you have any changes, let me know below, but it is considering the power, the flexibility, as well as how good the unit is and how often they are actually used, since pulling a crazy E1 on a unit that is old and weak would generally be kinda silly. Next up are their E2s. This will be quicker, but it's assuming you are at E1 and are looking for another upgrade. Wolfie's is a perma vulnerability and a bug spamming passive. This is nice for ramp up, but realistically is an Akron stat bot Eidolon. The thing is, you need a specific team to really abuse it right now, and it is mostly catered to helping out an older DPS instead of a brand new shiny one. Then Romy E2 can be skipped. The buff is weak, conditional, and doesn't even work with one of her best DPS, being Firefly, as it gives the attack buff to the damage dealt, not as a stat. Sparkle's E2 is a pretty nice one, adding 24% def ignore to her myriad of buffs. I wouldn't go from E0 to E2 in 2025, but if you're at E1 already, E2 is not a bad upgrade. I would probably wait until she gets more love to do so though. And Robin's E2 is a weird one. You get a team-wide speed increase during Concerto, but this speed increase could just do nothing for you if you don't build around it. It can help you hit breakpoints, and it can help you hit 180 speed to take another turn during Concerto. But not all teams can do it, and some teams can't really abuse it. It also batteries Robin a bit better, but ideally that's already a secure point in your teams. I think it's a great Eidolon, but in niche scenarios. Jiao Shou E2 turns his damage into something meaningful, however this still isn't that meaningful when outside of dot compositions. Even inside dot compositions with Hysilens out, we have 3 premium dot specific units already, rather than Jiao Shou having dot as an afterthought in his kit. I would skip his E2 when you can rather just pull an E0 Black Swan and save 2 pities. Then we have Fugue E2 with an energy buff, and then a buff to her ultimate that makes it actually do something. And here you'll get a Dance 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 cone embedded into her. Sometimes this advance could do nothing, but you're probably going to pull because you want that advance and know what to do. Fugue's E1 is really good, and her E2 is nice too, but again, Break are struggling, so it hurts the ranking for your average account. Next up, Sunday. He gets 2 SP after his very first ult, and then gives a 30% damage increase to his Beatified. The 2 SP is nice, but realistically your team should be good on SP if built properly and at E0S1 Sunday. It's only once too, so good luck if you have SP problems down the line, and I would not pull for a 30% damage buff. Tribby then gets a damage increase in her Eidolon too. She can already provide substantial damage at E0 in AoE, which gets even better E1, S1, and then E2 will just boost her damage contribution even more. I think you should just stick to E1, and her damage will fall off eventually when we get fewer targets and tankier bosses, but it's still an okay value pull right now. And then finally Cypher. 30% vulnerability sounds nice, but it's based on her hitting an enemy target. And since she is supposed to just spam her basics, this is only good in single target or maybe 2 targets if you play around her patron mark. She can never apply it in full AoE, and in Blast you'd have to use SP, which is not usually her thing. It's an okay pull regardless. And for Saridra, well, she's not out yet or close to being out, and I got so many Saridra comments on the light cone video despite this fact. So her Eidolons and her light cone will all be calculated and reviewed during her guide if I make one. Anyways, that's the E2s for you. I don't really like many of them, especially when you could do something like E1 Tribby and E1 Robin rather than E2 Tribby and E0 Robin. A few of them are niche, a few of them are okay, and a few of them are just not necessary. It's usually the DPS with the OP E2s. Anyways, and now it's Sustain time. From now on in the video, I will tackle Eidolons together in the review, but still rank them separately. I thought supportive ones should go separately, since a lot more people will probably go for them for universality, and their E1s are usually the important ones, so you can just skip the E2 part if you're bored. So let's check out Sustains. So Luocha was our very first. His E1 is a very underwhelming 20% attack to all allies that should just not be pulled at all, and you only probably pulled it by accident going for E6 Change Shui in 1.1. His E2 is then a healing buff or shield depending on the ally HP when using skill. This is really weak since his healing is usually sufficient without the buff, and the shield isn't that crazy. It is for one ally, and a lot of DPS he synergizes with don't want a shield, they want to lose HP. It's a skip on both Eidolons for Luocha. Then we have a slightly better E1 Luocha with Fushuan's Eidolon 1, 30% team-wide crit damage with a more permanent uptime. I would also not pull this though in this day and age, especially since there are many good sustains with more utility than her. Like, are you going to spend 80 pulls for a small crit damage buff? Then her E2 gives her a revive passive. She can revive her whole team technically if they die at the same time. It would help out any sustaining issues, but again, I feel like your pulls should be going to better things like a stronger, more utility-heavy sustain or investment on better units. Now, Hoho's E1 is still pretty nice. You could hit more breakpoints, or the same breakpoints but with less substantive investment, and she even gets an extra talent turn to help reduce skill point usage and help with the speed uptime. The thing is, I think it's overhyped because she doesn't need to skill spam even at E0. That was a massive misconception that is still kinda here to this day. So you just have the speed, which isn't always beneficial. It's a good pull, but it's not high priority. As for her E2, it is another revive like Fushuan. I don't think you should have sustain issues with Huohuo. I don't think I've ever died with her even on squishy teams like Dot. So just fix your team or rotation instead of pulling a whole nother Huohuo. Aventurine next. E1 is a team-wide 20% crit damage, so like a mini Fushuan E1, and then he gives his shield an ult now. The ult shield helps him work into more teams since some can absolutely ruin his uptime, and the crit damage is okay. I wouldn't pull Aventurine E1, but it's not useless. His E2 is then a 12% all-type res down on basic attacks. This is good for Acheron stacking, but again, specifically for one ult DPS, and then otherwise it's a single target and okay damage amp. I would skip this E2 today, but I recognize that it is better than most other Eidolon 2s on sustains. Next up is Lingsha with a pretty nice E1. First, a 50% weakness break efficiency buff, making her breaks faster and buffing her super break damage by a turn. Then a 20% def reduction on weakness broken enemies. The break team can stack up def ignore and reduction a ton, and so 20% is a major bonus. So for break teams and making her into her own break carry, this is strong to really strong. For non-break teams though, this E1 is not good. And her E2 is just a team-wide break effect buff, and even in a break team, this is just a drop in the ocean because of how much this team can stack it up already. Skip on E2 for sure. Now Hysilens decided the age of bad sustain Eidolons is over and has some stupidly strong ones. You don't need to pull them to click content as demonstrated so many times with her, but you can't deny her Eidolons are fantastic vertical investment options versus any other sustain. Her E1 will not only give her better healing when she doesn't even need it, but it will give her after rain buff an additional 50% HP buff, which is just stupid. It's not that good if you're not a HP scaler though. However, E2 doesn't care about what you scale on, as you now will get a 30% speed increase permanently from Hysilens, and this works on the whole team. It won't let you run stuff like base speed DPS on 134 Sunday, since Sunday would also get the speed buff, but it will let you run your normal setups at such a higher speed. It can be really strong. So first, here is my Eidolon 1 ranking. A lot of them could have been decent back in the day, but are just not a high priority these days when looking at the stuff we can get instead. And we can see that the later sustains got juicier and juicier E1s. Here is my Eidolon 2 ranking. A lot of them are just completely int to pull and can be solved by making your team better, only a couple have some value. If you think an Eidolon should be higher or lower, let me know below, but a lot of these E2s are just terrible. Finally, for this video, we'll be tackling our lovely DPS Eidolons. Now, these are tricky to do because it will be based on how good they are in the meta more than the other categories, as sustains and supports are fewer and last longer. So an Eidolon 2 like Lune's was insane back in the day, but pulling it in 2025 buffs Wenhoyo. And because of that, I'm first going to put a lot of early character Eidolons in the skip tier. It's not like Lycones where they may be usable on other units, it's an investment that is tied to an older unit that cannot be moved around. So Seele E2 can be crazy for her, and she has some crazy heights from dedicated fans at E0, but you shouldn't pull for Seele Eidolons for meta value. Jingyu Wen's early Eidolons are both weak. His E1 is alright, but again, E1 and E2 on him are just not good pulls. Now weirdly, at 1.2 we had Kafka and Blade, but they just got buffed and Kafka just got Hysilens, so they're in a different situation. Maybe Zila and Jingyuen's positions here will change in the next batch of buffs too. If you care for the dot meta and want to keep using Kafka, E1 is a fantastic upgrade with 30% dot vulnerability from her attacks. If you're scared of dot falling into irrelevancy again though, you can hold off. And E2 Kafka is just a damage buff and a weak one at that. Definitely skip the E2 even if you love dot, there are much better pulls. Blade E1 is a really strong upgrade to his damage since it specializes in helping out in single target. You get HP loss multipliers on his enhanced basic now, whilst also adding the same multiplier to his ult that already had some. Since Blade is now decent at E0, E1 isn't as bad as it used to be, and of course it was buffed when Blade got his changes. Remember though, he is a 50-50 loss character, and so I wouldn't pull for his Eidolons when you can just eventually lose to it. And his E2 is lackluster as it's a crit rate buff, and again, can be lost to, so I would skip this. Now on to Dill, who's a weird one because he was the first to have a big E2 as a DPS. Well, Raiden Shogun was before him, but different game. I think I'd still put both of his Eidolons as a skip, since he didn't receive any buffs unlike Blade or Kafka, and those units also got a ton of synergistic releases like Hysilens for Blade and Hysilens for Kafka to help them even more. I will put his E1 in the skip tier, but I will put his E2 in the OK tier because it's still a really big upgrade for him and makes him usable. I'd rather you invest into other units though. Then we have Jingliu, who was just buffed in 3.4. Her E1 used to be really good in specific scenarios, well now it's really good at all times. They will give a bit of crit damage, but then more importantly, a big multiplier increase on enhanced skills and ultimates. Excellent upgrade for her, but since she isn't top tier, I'll have to mark it lower. Her E2 can be completely skipped though, as it is just some damage percent on the enhanced skill, and so it's not that good for that amount of pulls. And of course, Topaz was released with her too. Topaz's E1 was a decent pull back in the follow-up days, but now she is rarely used as much. She was replaced by Morza in high ceiling phase Xiao teams and replaced by Cypher otherwise, whilst not being nearly as universal as Cypher. So for that reason, I'd skip both of her Eidolons even if her E1 is not bad. Argenti is next and an instant skip on his Eidolon 1 and 2. A bunch of crit damage and some attack percent, they are both pretty weak on an already weak baseline unit. He is mostly used as a pure fiction carry that doesn't need these Eidolons, or the Herta battery that also doesn't need this Eidolons. Man, the DPS part is getting a bit depressing. Then of course we have our lovely Dr. Ratio. Even if he's doing okay sometimes, he is still an older DPS, and again, his Eidolon 1 and 2 are not that powerful. His E2 is a bit better than the E1, but when he did well at E0, with his Eidolons being far less valuable than support ones to help him out. 2.x time! Luckily Black Swan had Hysilens released before I dropped this video, as she has got much stronger thanks to the triple dot setup. And to get her even stronger, you can slap on her E1, a very nice vertical investment option for dot just like Kafka E1, but generally stronger. The thing is, Kafka's is more universal as Kafka is our sole dot enabler right now. At E1, you also enable Black Swan to run Hysilens as Lycone, which can let Hysilens instead run Black Swan's Lycone for even more team power. But because Hysilens Kafka is the core duo, even if Black Swan is top tier as a third slot and gets even better at E1, I don't know how long she will last, and so keep that in mind when investing. And then Black Swan E2 can just be skipped unless you really struggle in pure fiction, but even in pure fiction on Hysilens release, I didn't feel a problem with triple dot, maybe in the future. Now, it's Acheron time, and this is going to be a spicy one. Her E1 is like Blade's E2, but a little stronger and more permanent. I wouldn't pull just for this at all, it's a stepping stone to an E2. Now, the E2 is weird. It was really good on release since we had barely any good Nihility supports, and so bringing one with one Harmony and then getting the full Abyss passive was kind of mega. Then Jiaoshu released and it was still good. But then Silverwolf buffs and Cypher release, well now her two Nihility teams are really strong. And so going all the way to E2 just to remove one of them for a Harmony, which may not even be that much stronger, is just a horrible feeling. Nihility units can generate a ton of stacks whilst also buffing her, whereas a Harmony unit maybe lets her generate more stacks on her own turns and also buffs her. It isn't really that great of a trade-off anymore, but it's still good and still enables teams, so I can't put it too low. Buto next. His E1 helps a ton with ramp up and gives an alright amount of def ignore. The thing is, he loves Fugue, and Fugue helps with the initial ramp up just fine, so I don't think his E1 is really valuable anymore. If you don't have her or use her, I guess it's still good, but break without Fugue sounds really rough, especially now. His E2 can then also just be skipped, as I don't see him regularly having SP issues in his best teams, and the break effect buff is very lackluster. And now for Jade, with a really cool E1 that is one of my favorites in the game for how it enables new synergies. It gives her a small but welcome buff, but the real source is that it lets every attack from her deck collector now give a minimum of 3 charge stacks. So now she can synergize nicely with single target DPS, and those usually attack at a high frequency. Therefore, we can enable some single target DPS to perform much better in pure fiction, but it also lets her perform better in non-AoE modes in the opposite way. It's a very cool Eidolon, but I still don't think it's that much of a priority, since a bunch of DPS are more hypercarry oriented. And her E2 can be skipped, as it's just a crit rate buff. There are much better things out there. And then we had Firefly just after. Her E1 is like Buhil's with some utility and some def ignore. Her utility is in skill points, which is sometimes nice depending on the team. It lets her run Linkshire much better now, or lets Harmony MC spam skill. But pulling an E1 just to enable sustain isn't fantastic. This is more of a stepping stone to her very strong E2. So that E2 will let her get extra turns every other enhanced skill or basic attack, provided it kills or breaks an enemy. More turns is a very powerful benefit, especially for a DPS that needs to break as much and as fast as possible. This E2 lets her clear very well even today. I wouldn't pull for her all the way up to E2 if you're new, especially if you're missing teammates. But if you love her and have her team invested from before, it's a fantastic upgrade to keep her going. A patch later, we had a break from Penacony with Yun Li. Her E1 is a small buff with damage percent, but then a big buff with extra damage instances in her massive counter, and thus a big multiplier increase. It is one of the stronger E1s for DPS, but because she's not a high performer, it can't be placed with some other big E1s later on. E2 is just a 20% def ignore bait, and her teams don't naturally stack it, so definitely a skip on this one. And of course, we have Fei Xiao just after Yun Li. Fei Xiao still has a very nice ceiling with possible action count min-maxing. Now her E1 is a stepping stone to a potent E2, but not gonna lie, the E1 is a strong stepping stone. You get an original damage multiplier buff to her ultimate, which is a very rare multiplier, and it's a sizable one too. So a not bad upgrade by itself, but then getting closer to E2 is another bonus. Her E2 makes her flying Ori stack up even more than usual, and being able to spam out even more ultimates on Fei Xiao makes her a beast. I will probably put her in the same tier as Firefly, since they release at similar times and have similar upgrades in the E2, but if I had to choose one E2 out of these two, it would probably be Fei Xiao's. Now for Rapper the Brain Rot Queen. Her E1 is a classic break E1 with the def ignore and then some energy after exiting Seal form. The problem is that the energy in my testing back in the day was not necessary, and with Fugue it should be even less of a problem. It may be nice for comfort, but I don't like Rapper E1. Her E2 is a little better as it improves her single target performance, but she prefers AoE anyway, so the single target buff isn't always that impressive. I'd probably skip both Eidolons, with E2 being okay value. And then we hit 3.x with a whole ton of DPS units, so lock in. First, the Herta. She's like Fei Xiao, where she has a monstrous E2, but still a decent E1 that isn't just a stepping stone. Her E1 makes her interpretation, stacking, and calculation much better, basically giving her enhanced skills more consistency and damage. And then her E2 is just crazy. Inspiration on battle start and another on ult is already nice, meaning she can enhance skill once on battle start and twice after every ult. But then they decided to give her 35% action advance on each enhanced skill. There's not much to say, it is a top tier E2. Now for Aglaea and her notoriously strong E1. Sometimes she can ignore energy problems at E0, but E1 just removes them, and even makes her be able to take more turns in general because of how much energy she is generating. So, combining no downtime with more turns and you have an Omega E1. Her E2 is then good, but not close to that big E1. She and her Memo Sprite get stacking def ignore when they take back-to-back actions with each other, and ulting counts too, but it's not always reliable and can fall off annoyingly. Since ult into EBA is 2 stacks, it has some decent base power, so it's still a good pull among E2s, especially considering Aglaea's normal strength. Next up, Mighty, and because his Eidolons are a bit weird, I consulted a Mighty expert. Well, I hope he was an expert because he's got Mighty in his name. Anyways, another big E1. His is more conditional since it only really pops off at 4 to 5 targets, but making a blast DPS do great in AoE is a pretty good reason to invest more into him and helps a bunch for pure fiction. I don't think it is as strong as Aglaea's though, since hers is less conditional. As for his E2, it gives him some def ignore, which is okay, but then it lets him gain charge from healing. This makes Sustains much more desirable, but still benefits Sustainers thanks to his self-heals from the ult and revive charging him up, and so it leads to more Godslayers over in either team type. So E2 is a decent one, even if it's not the Herta E2. And then we hit the anniversary with Castoris. Not gonna lie, this feels like another the Herta. You have a great E1 that is also a stepping stone to a powerful E2. E1 is an original damage buff dependent on enemy HP, and E2 gives extra Dragon Breaths, more ults, and more Castoris turns. Unfortunately, the E2 does hurt RMC synergy, but you can just slot in other units in their place and abuse its power. Very strong E2. I'm going to place her E1 and E2 in the same spot as the Hertas. Now, Anaxa has a really solid base kit, but his Eidolons I feel like kinda got taxed by his the Herta synergy. His E1 is just 1 SP in the whole fight and some def reduction. That's like some 1 to 2 point X tier Eidolon, even if he can build a bunch of def ignore. His E2 however is a bit better, as it will reduce all enemies all-time res by 20%, helping his sub-DPS teams but more importantly his main DPS teams. I would not pull his E1, he is a beast at E0 S0, but if you are at E1, then his E2 value is not bad. Definitely not top tier among E2s though. Then we move all the way to 3.4 with Finan, Archer, Saber. Now Finan is gone, but Archer and Saber will be sticking around a while. To Finan first, just like the Herta and Castoris, he starts off with a very strong Eidolon 1 that will help shorten his fixed AV and thus let him clear faster in any content, whilst also giving him some crit damage. But again, a stepping stone, and this time to the strongest E2 we have so far. His E2 will give him res pen, but then give him a bunch of extra turns and thus let him spam out more attacks and meteors within a fight. It is ridiculously strong. Because 3.x DPS are all performing similarly at a base, I think Finan E2s still should go with ones like Castoris and the Herta, but if I had to choose one E2 to win in the list, it would be Finan's. Yes, you can't do 0 AV clears, but that's not the point for 99% of players. Now, for the Fate collab units. Both of the E1s are nice, but Archer's is definitely better. Archer will get 2 SP after 3 skill uses in one turn, which not only reduces reliance on Sparkle, but also just makes him do much more in any team. It's not 1 SP once like a Naxa, it's 2 SP every time he does 3 skills. Sabers gives a neat damage buff, and then a bunch more core resonance, which in the long run is better ult consistency, and in practice can help a lot with team rotations. The calculations wise it may be a little weak, but I like it in practice. As for the E2s, you can skip either of them. Archer's E2 is res reduction and quantum weakness, but you should usually be against quantum weakness anyway, you don't ult that much compared to skill, and it is only on one target, so it won't help when swapping targets around. Saber's E2 is some def ignore and a multiplier boost to her skill, but it's not that much in overall damage in a fight, as most of her damage is in ultimates, and she does some decent damage with her enhanced basics too. So E1s are nice on both of them, ideally Archers, but E2s can be ignored. And so then finally we have Hysilens. Her E1 gives all dots an original damage multiply increase, which is already really good, but then doubles her talent's dot instances. This means she goes from 4 dots to 8, which is already a bunch of damage, but then it will also max out her ultimate zone dot cap. So 1, 2, 3 buffs all in one Eidolon. In 2 dot comps, this is very strong and similar to Aglaea's in power, and it is still very good in 3 dot comps. For this reason, I'd like to rank it on the same tier, as Aglaea's E1 can also vary, but these two don't vary as much as an E1 like Mighty's. But then you can skip the E2. It's okay value in triple dot as it will boost Kafka and Black Swan, but in 2 dot it is really weak for a whole extra pity. Dot would rather you invest into an E1 Kafka or E1 Black Swan or S1 Hysilens rather than an E2 Hysilens. And finally, here are my rankings for E1s and E2s on our DPS roster. Remember, part of it is strength, but part of it is also how good the unit is, which makes it kind of a DPS tier list, but not really. Because whilst E2 Dill is OP for him, these days E2 Dill is far behind the new E2s in account value. Some E2s like Fireflies are still going to be better than a weak one like Hysilens E2, but only in value from the E1s to E2s. This is not saying that you should pull from no Firefly to E2 Firefly over no Hysilens to E2 Hysilens, but it's just saying that if you had both at E1 and wanted to further invest into one of them, then you go E2 Firefly is a stronger upgrade because of how much it transforms her. Anyways, that's the end. A long one because it's 2 different things on every single limited 5-star, but I hope it helps you guys out. Let me know if you want an Eidolon and Lycan review every year or any other video topics. Thanks to my amazing YouTube members, and have a Guoba day.